These words from the Apostle Paul. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future nor any powers, neither height nor depth nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the reckless love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Good morning, my name is Jim Furrow. It is a pleasure, thank you Lee for those kind words. It's a gift for me to be with you this morning and also to be with the Joshua Center this past week and an opportunity to work with people who are working with couples and families in this area. We're going to talk about marriage today, but one of the things that I think is really important for me to help frame for all of us is whether you're single or married, divorced, widowed, wherever you find yourself this day in life in relationship, that we all stand under, in, through the faithfulness of God. That reckless love that chooses the one over the 99 is what we want to think about in the context of marriage. That's going to be my focus today. But I want us not to think, and you'll hear my comment on this in a moment, I don't want us to think that marriage in some way is an ultimate expression. It is a window into what God is doing in the world, and it's important in that way. It's a unique relationship. It's a relationship that God uses to describe his relationship to the church. And in that, we need to listen carefully, biblically, to an understanding of what Jesus saw when he talked about marriage. And that'll be my focus. But again, as Lee mentioned, I have for some time taught in a school of psychology at Fuller. And one of the things that I often did in the context of my teaching was to give a test. So I thought we'd begin with a psychological test. Are you up for it? Okay, so here you go. Are you ready? Everyone ready? Here we go. I'm going to show you something, and I want to know what you see. Do you see an old lady, or do you see a young woman? Or do you see your mother? Oh, okay, it's a psychological joke. Anyway, how many of you saw an old woman? First thing you saw was an old woman, okay? How many of you saw a young lady? Okay. Now, what's interesting about this, this is a drawing that was composed by Dr. Boring, a psychologist, kind of a dangerous name, I guess. And one of the things he wanted to use to illustrate is this idea that when we look at a drawing like this, and he drew this drawing from it was from the 1880s, a postcard that was popular at the time. And so he simplified the drawing, and he uses it as an exercise in perception. Because what we see in this diagram is both an old lady and a young woman. Right? The visual information is the same. So it's up to your mind to make the distinction of whether you see an old lady or a young woman. And that, I think, is a great illustration of the way that oftentimes two people in a relationship are exposed to the same information but can see it very differently, right? And it's also the case that when we read accounts of Jesus teaching in the New Testament, one of the things that we see in the gospel narratives is that Jesus is often encountering in his interactions with the Pharisees ways of their seeing that are quite different from his own. Same circumstances, same situation, but they are struck by the difference that Jesus sees something completely different. One of those situations, we find Jesus encountering Pharisees who are again here to test him. Testing him on a controversy of their own making where they were debating what are the grounds for divorce. In other words, how stringent do we need to be and what justifies a biblical divorce, if you will. So some Pharisees wanted to test Jesus, so they came to him and asked if it was right for a man to divorce his wife. Jesus asked them, "What does the law of Moses say about this?" And they answered, "Moses allows a man to write out divorce papers and send his wife away." So just a bit of context, in Mosaic law, a divorce certificate was authorized or granted by God to the people because in that patriarchal society, if you were a woman, you were reliant on your relationship with a man for your very existence in life. And if that man who was your husband put you away or put you out or no longer chose you in relationship, you were vulnerable. You had no option. You had no right in that society. So a certificate of divorce recognized that that relationship was no longer binding. So it was an exercise of freedom in that way. They answered, "Moses allows a man to write out divorce papers and send his wife away." Jesus replied, "Moses gave you this law because you are so heartless. But in the beginning, God made a man and a woman. That's why a man leaves his father and mother and gets married. He becomes like one person with his wife. Then they are no longer two people, but one. And no one should separate a couple that God has joined together." So the Pharisees were asking the question, what are the rules? What are the rules? And Jesus, looking at the same situation, says, what about the relationship? What about the relationship? Because that's where God's intent lives. Because that is where God lives. Right? Think about for a moment the Old Testament. Think about for a moment the Ten Commandments. When did the Ten Commandments come? The Ten Commandments came after the rescue, after the Exodus. God saved Israel, and then God gave Israel an understanding of what it meant to be his people. His salvation came first. Relationship before the rules. I've entitled this talk, especially as I'm thinking about the context to marriage, Belonging and Becoming. Right? See, because oftentimes, in my experience with couples, it's oftentimes we find that one person or the other person wants to put the becoming before the belonging. Right? If you were a different person, if you had something different to offer me, if you would solve this problem, or if you would address this issue, or if you would work harder, if you would become something different, I would love you. God doesn't work that way. Jesus saw that. It wasn't about the grounds, he said to the Pharisees. It's about the relationship. And looking back, we have to look back about how God started this thing to begin with. And that was with relationship. Okay? So what I want to do is to talk a little bit about marriage and to think about marriage. And when I say that, sometimes I think about The Princess Bride and marriage. It just sort of is right here. I'm sorry I have to say that to get that out of my mind. But we're going to talk about marriage in a contemporary cultural context just to get a view, because Jesus was doing the same thing at his time. We want to do the same thing in our time. So one of the dangers that we have in our society today is that we have elevated marriage in a very unique way. Right? Now we all know and we're all familiar with this idea that, most couples who marry today in the United States are at a risk of divorce about 50% of the time. And that idea comes from the fact that when we look at marriage rates and divorce rates, the divorce rates are typically about half of those of marriage. Now, one of the things that I want to draw your attention to that might not be obvious in this diagram is that the rate of marriage is declining since 2000. And if we dial back the calendar to 1960, one of the things that we'll see is that the marriage rate has been on a steep decline. The number of people marrying in the United States has been on a steep decline since 1960. So divorce isn't just the problem in this sense, it's also people are choosing later to marry, but also sometimes not to marry. There's, as some commentators would say, there's a question in our society today if people still value marriage. Cohabitation is part of this story, and if we look at from 1960 to relatively where we are now, there's a 17-fold increase in the number of people who are cohabitating. And often this is occurring before marriage. It's sort of a test drive of a relationship for a lot of couples, with consequences, because the literature would also suggest that actually cohabitating before marriage may make those marriages more prone to divorce. Not always, but there's at least some indication that that's the case for some. But this suggests that we haven't given up on being couples. We just have some questions about marriage. Now, when sociologists look at these trends, one of the things that they're saying is that marriage and its role in society has changed a little bit. So it used to be that marriage was the marker of the beginning of a relationship, or a wedding was the marker of a beginning of a relationship. Now, often weddings are sort of the star on top of the Christmas tree of the relationship. It's sort of an accomplishment that a couple reaches. So now people will say, we will put off marriage. They'll cohabitate in a relationship. They'll put off marriage until they are ready. And often ready means that we have the financial wherewithal to have the quality of life that we want to have to start a family or to have a life together. Or they'll have a child and then they'll say, maybe we'll go ahead and get married. You see, they're not necessarily choosing marriage as a unique state. It's a way to recognize a relationship that's already underway. That's one of the dynamics. Another is that the way people evaluate their relationship is based on whether it's good for me. Not good for us, not good for our kids, but does my marriage make me a better person? Does my marriage make me a happier person? And if it doesn't, then maybe I have the wrong person. Not wrong relationship, but the wrong person. So that's a third dynamic that's common in the thoughts of many people about marriage, is we want to choose the right person. Like, the relationship will go better if we have the right person. And we have a very powerful set of technologies now that enable us to find the right person. And if we don't find the right person, or this person doesn't turn out to be the right person, we just swipe right. Right? And the power of that is really phenomenal, because if you go back and talk to a sociologist in the 1960s and 70s, they would say the number one predictor of mate selection was something called propinquity. In other words, when I first saw my wife, I walked up to Louise and I said, man, you have amazing propinquity. No, actually, it really is the idea that you will marry somebody that's physically close to you. Now we live in a time where physical distance is mediated by technology, and so the search for the right person can get quite specific. I have a friend who really predated this period. He was an electrical engineer, also a computer science major in college. He was committed to the left brain and intentionality, a Christian, a man of great character and confidence. Also gregarious, attractive, and hot on the dating market. And so he, in his own determination, decided, so we're in his early 30s, that it was time to marry. And so, as the intentional, scientifically minded person that he was, he got out his Excel spreadsheet and he put across the columns all the characteristics and qualities that he would want in someone who would be suitable, choosable, desirable as his spouse. And then, because he was gregarious, popular, attractive, and hot on the dating market, he had a number of rows, which he then simply entered the names and then began to rate across the columns, tabulate, and designate, and then pursue this individual. Now, granted, and she responded, it was wonderful. He proposed, they got engaged. I was there when she found out about the spreadsheet. Wasn't pretty. Wasn't pretty. Beautiful marriage, blessed, loving couple, decide to have a child, birth of their first child. One of the consequences of the birth of their first child is that her body shifted and she developed a rapid onset of rheumatoid arthritis, to the point that early in their child's life, she was no longer able to physically carry the child because of the degeneration in her shoulders. And every prediction was that by the time that she was 50, she was going to be in a wheelchair, incapacitated by the arthritis. One of the prominent columns on his spreadsheet was athletic, physically active. It's a big part of his life. He wanted that to be a big part of his family life. And all of a sudden, not only did that column come into question, but sort of his assumptions about the way his relationship would work and the role of his own caregiving in that relationship dramatically changed. I'll have something more to say about that story toward the end, but let me leave it there to suggest that one of the things that we do when we focus on choice and we focus on selection and we focus on the type of person is we kind of set ourselves up for a particular way of seeing, right? We set ourselves up for a particular way of seeing. And that's kind of common in our culture because this is from a Gallup poll in the early 2000s where they asked 20-somethings about this idea of finding a soulmate. The numbers are striking to me. Even in the context of the doubts about marriage, listen to these numbers. 94% of those who responded, national random poll, want their married partner to be their soulmate. 88% believe there's a special person, a soulmate, waiting for them somewhere out there, and we're just waiting for them to pop up. 87% believe they will find their soulmate when they are ready to marry. So it'll just, be at the right time. And 6% believe that it's unlikely that they will stay married to the same person for life. So there's this pressure, there's this expectation that couples face when they're thinking about who do I marry, about making the right choice. It's set up by our culture. It's set up by Amazon. It's set up by Match.com. It's set up by all these ways that we have to choose always what's the best thing for us. And I wonder, right, if Jesus were in this moment, if he looked at how we approach these kind of decisions, if he would say, boy, you guys pay a whole lot of attention to the rules. I don't think you often understand relationship, right? Because when it comes to marriage, Will Willimon is a theologian who wrote this about this process. He says, most people think that the toughest part of marriage is deciding whom we ought to marry, making the right choice. We say we're deciding whether or not we are in love with this person, whether or not we are emotionally attached. The problem with such a view is that we always marry the wrong person. He goes on, we are conditioned to think that only what we decide is right for ourselves is right for us. The trouble with such a view is that marriage, like parenting, requires that we make sense out of being stuck with certain people for no good reason or justification. What does that mean? Well, that means when two people stand in front of each other and in front of witnesses, and they make a commitment to marriage, the person that they are marrying in that moment, at that wedding, is going to change. That is not the person they're going to be married to 10 years from now. That is not the person they're going to be married 20 years from now. When I'm sitting across from a couple and I'm talking to a wife who's in tears because she's saying to me, I'm not sure I can keep doing this. She's saying, I'm not sure I can live with the on-again, off-again struggle of my husband's addiction and the cost to our family and the cost economically to our future and the cost to me personally. This isn't really what I thought was going to happen. Right? You see, what Willimon says is morally, we move into the future based on decisions that we made without knowing what we were getting into. Right? We don't know the future. Fact of the matter is that when most couples stand in front of a minister, stand in a church, stand before God and witnesses, and promise for better or for worse, most people are betting on better. Very few in that moment are thinking about worse. Most of us in our relationships are always looking for better. We don't know what to do with worse, right? That's what makes marriage more difficult. That's what makes marriage more challenging. And I would suggest to you, all the more difficult in a culture that says your marriage should make you better. Your marriage should make your life happier. Your marriage should be fulfilling to you. It just gets translated to the other person to, why are you not making my life better? Right? Would that be what Jesus understood is God's intent? You see, part of the dynamic that Willimon's wanting us to think about is the notion of faithfulness or fidelity, right? And so Old Testament theologian Walter Brueggemann makes this distinction. When we read stories about Jesus, and one of the things that we see going on with the Pharisees and Jesus, even in the discussion of divorce, is the Pharisees want to know what's certain. They want to know what's true. They want to know what's right, so they want to get the right rule. And the problem with that in the Gospels, Brueggemann says, is that the Gospels are not about certainty. They're not about certitude. They're about faithfulness. They're about fidelity, in his words. So we have to acknowledge our thirst for certitude. We want certainty. You know, you talk to a couple who's considering getting married and they say to me, do I know I'm marrying the right person? How do I know I'm marrying the right person? Is this the right person? Well, like we're matched, on these things and these characteristics and these qualities, and my friends think this and my family thinks this, and I think we're good to go. But you never get an answer to that question because you still have to stand there and look in their eyes and promise, right? Because the wedding contract is not just signing that I'm going to do my part, you're going to do your part, and as long as we both do our parts, then we're good. Actually, no, what we're doing in that moment is looking at the other person and saying, I will show up. I will be there. I love you. The other person's saying the same to us. That's not about certainty. No one can promise certainty. It's about fidelity. And that is where God lives, right? That is reckless love. That is what Will Willimon writes about when he says, love is an adventure, right? Because you don't know what's coming your way. And the question is, how will you respond in that moment, in that way? And it's with faithfulness and fidelity. Going back to Jesus' words, Moses gave you this law because you are so heartless. Keep in mind that Jesus isn't saying that those who divorce are heartless. Jesus is saying the reason the law is there is because your society treats those who divorce so poorly. We have to have a way of recognizing that, right? And I don't know sometimes how well we do as a church to those who have faced the tragedy of a broken relationship, right? If we have become a community that has more of a heart for those who have found themselves in places that they didn't even choose, right? But in the beginning, God made man and a woman. That's why a man leaves his father and mother and gets married. He becomes like one person with his wife. Now that's not, that oneness that we're talking about is not the wedding. It is not them being sexually consummating their marriage. That's not the oneness we're talking about. It's the oneness that they live. It's not the oneness that they get by being married. And that oneness is wrapped up in how they keep their promises together, right? The story they keep telling about love in their relationship, the way they keep showing up for each other. And no one should separate a couple that God has joined together, because God is ultimately all about faithfulness. That's what we sang about when we sang about God's reckless love. That's the one. God is not going to forget the one because he's got 99. He's going to go for the one, right? The stories of faithfulness we live in marriage live in the larger story of God's faithfulness for us, right? Whether you're single, divorced, whether you're widowed or married, God's faithfulness for you is the same, right? And we are all called in to live a life of faithfulness, especially in marriage. Let me zoom in and just pick on a couple of ideas in this passage where Jesus is referring back to Genesis. Right? We can't think about ourselves as individuals without thinking about the idea that we are created in the image of God. But you have to slow that down for a second and recognize that when we read the text in Genesis about being created in the image of God, we are created in relationship and we are created for relationship, right? We have an incomplete identity, right? An incomplete image of God without relationship. That's not saying that everybody has to be married, but everybody is created for relationship because God himself is in relationship. Notice the plural pronoun. Now we will make humans. Not I, but we will make humans. God is saying something here about the nature and substance of who God is. God is in relationship. So God created humans to be like himself. He made men and women, right? For each other. Complementarity. Together, the whole notion of completeness comes through relationship. And it's through relationship that we know ourselves. You see, that's why I said it's belonging that leads to becoming. We discover who we are, right, in our own identity in the context of relationship. As a child, how did you know who you were, right? You didn't one day awake and say, okay, I'm Steve. I know who Steve is. Steve is this way, right? I'm going to decide who Steve is. I'm going to make Steve. I am Steve, right? It just doesn't work that way, right? Here's your test. Go home today. Take a moment. Walk into the bathroom. Look in the mirror. Stare in the mirror. Who is it that you're seeing? Steve? Some of you maybe. But let me suggest to you, when you look at that in that mirror and you see the reflection and you ask the question, who is this I'm looking at? The only way you can know who that is through the relationships that you have. through the relationships that you have had, through the relationships that you have, through the things that people say about you, the things that the people who stand with you, the people who stand against you, the people who've given words of praise and recognition of the character qualities that you see in that mirror because other people have seen that as true about you, as well as those who have taken things from you or dismissed you or discouraged you about who you are. All of that comes together when we look at ourselves because we were created in relationship, right? And we know ourselves in the context of relationship. And there is purpose in that. There is purpose. That's the nature of things. That's the nature of being human. And so it matters all the more that in relationship that we are faithful to one another. We're faithful to see the dignity of another because they're created in God's image. Also working in the back scenes and the words that Jesus used, especially about this idea, let no one take apart a relationship that God has put together. Is that's not just saying that if you go in front of a church and you get married in front of a minister and you have people praying for you, that all of a sudden you've metaphysically created a unique relationship that cannot be broken. That's not the point. That's not what's in view when Jesus is teaching this. What Jesus is saying is don't break the faithfulness that God is so committed to, right? He's saying to the Pharisees, don't treat it so lightly. Don't you recognize what is at stake here? Because the covenants that couples make, the faithful commitments that they make to each other, the promises that they make to each other are promises like the promises that God makes to us. All that to say, what marriage creates in our society, what marriage creates in this room is a window into what faithfulness looks like, right? What faithfulness looks like in a relationship. What it means to make promises and keep promises. Make promises and keep promises. That's what it means to be created in the image of God. Karl Barth, a noted theologian, said that, what is intrinsic to human being is the desire to make and keep promises. Because that's the nature of God, right? And so it's challenging. I was thinking about the best picture. Okay, these are two dudes, but it's the best picture I could find of a ropes course at this particular moment. But now, so these guys are pushing. This is some of you have been to a ropes course. You know this moment where you're on these wires. You're 40 feet off the ground. You have to traverse a path where the wires go further and further apart. And as they go further and further apart, you have to adjust both to the lateral movement of your partner, but you also have to adjust to the ways in which you have to rebalance each time, balancing their weight against your weight. This reminds me a lot of the couples that I see in clinical practice, right? This reminds me of a lot of the couples that I see in my church who are sliding together, making their way through life, balancing each other in love, in faithfulness, and then all of a sudden, somebody loses their job. Or all of a sudden, a chronic illness shows up. Or all of a sudden, a child dies. And I've got to find my balance. I've got to find my way. I've got to find you. If I don't find you, I will fall. Right? These dudes, they're wired in. They're hooked up. If they fall, what's going to happen? Right. Their male ego will be damaged. But they're safe. Not always the case in a couple's relationship. People fall. Tragedy happens. Brokenness happens. But God's faithfulness is the same. God's faithfulness is the same. But I want you to keep this in mind because the core of a relationship, this is my point. starts with belonging, right? The core of a relationship starts with belonging and depending and being vulnerable with another person, where you say to them, you can count on me, and they say to you, you can count on me. And to the degree that we can count on each other, our marriage, our relationship will be strong, even against the storms of life. Love is an adventure. It's not a certainty. You don't know what's coming. You don't know what's coming. You don't know what's coming. And because you don't, you face that fear together. Not only with your relationship horizontally, but also vertically, because what we're talking about here today is we're talking about marriage. But we're always talking about marriage and the promises that we make in marriage in light of God's promise to us, which is why I read that passage from Romans 8. There is nothing. We have a connection. God's faithfulness is not contingent upon us becoming something. God's faithfulness isn't based on us. We belong, and as we belong, we become like Him. And I think one critical point, especially for someone like myself who spends a lot of time talking with couples who are not trying to figure out how we got where we got, how we have lost the love that we had. And I was really struck this week when I was working with some people at the Joshua Center, and I was watching a session with a couple who were really struggling and finding and fighting and struggling to find their way because they had lost their way together. And there was this powerful moment at the end of the session where they made a step toward each other, and it was this really touching moment. You could still feel the distance between them, but you could also feel that they had taken a step closer to each other. And as the therapist was noticing this with them and celebrating this in a small way with them, what became clear is the reason that they were doing that, why it was so important for them, why they would put themselves through really some agony in trying to face themselves and face each other, is because they had children who they did not want to face the same thing that they as kids had faced. They wanted to write a different story. They wanted to write a story for them. They wanted to open a window and show those children what love looks like when it's complicated, when it's conflicted, when it doesn't look pretty, but two people keep showing up, keep saying, I'm here, I'm going to go again, I'm going to work again. Because one of my favorite quotes from George Will is that, parents raise children physically, children raise parents emotionally, right? What Will's point is that there's a lot of humility in raising a child, right? Kids are very forgiving. They come that way. They come with challenges, but often the challenges that parents experience are not their child, they're themselves. I would say the same is true for marriage, that marriage requires humility. The strength that it requires, the commitment that it requires, are not based on your ability to choose someone who's going to like you, someone who is going to be like you. It actually begins with humility and recognizing that for most of us, for many of us, on a good day we might have what it takes, but on a bad day we often don't. We often don't have the love we need for the love that is needed, right? And in those moments, we can't blame our partner. We can't blame our parents. Certain people do. We need to turn in a different direction. So, in closing, let me direct you to Philippians 2 as a way to kind of help us sort of cement an understanding of what is needed in these moments of belonging is a certain humility that's not just unique to marriage, but it's what God is calling us to as his family together. Christ encourages you, and his love comforts you. God's Spirit unites you, and you are concerned for others. Now make me completely happy. Live in harmony by showing love for each other. Some of you are here today, you're in a relationship, and a majority of couples, right? I mean, the typical couple has an argument about 70% of the time that they can never solve. Conflict, difficulty, emotional challenges, that goes with the territory. And you might find yourself where you're feeling a struggle in the dining room, or having a fight in the living room, or maybe disconnected in the bedroom, and you find yourself in this relationship that you don't know what to do, and you say to yourself, well, if I just had more love, or if my partner had more love, my wife had more love, my husband had more love, we would have a better relationship. And let me suggest to you today, from a biblical perspective, from a perspective of humility, that you will never have all the love that you need. Not together, right? It wasn't designed that way, right? The love that you need to make the love that you have grow will come from the love that's in this room. Because the love that is in this room is a love that you didn't choose, but it's one that you figure out how to have, right? So the resources for the love that's needed in marriage begin in the love that we share together, because God is faithful to give that love to us. So in closing, let me give this prayer for you, a word of blessing and a word of promise. God, thank you that you promise your faithfulness to us, that promise of faithfulness is never ending. It's unbroken. There's nothing that we can do that can destroy that promise, because you are forever faithful. I pray for the wives and husbands in this room. I pray for those that are considering marriage. I pray for those who have found themselves outside of marriage because of death or divorce. God, I pray for those who are wondering where marriage is even in their life, God. I pray, God, that your faithfulness will be the most clear and certain thing in their life. God, your love wins. Your love fills. Your love is ultimately all in all. Thank you, God, for the gift of marriage. Thank you, Lord, for the gift of your faithful love. Lead us on to love more and more like you. In Jesus' name, amen.